Hello everyone, welcome to A Good Night for a Murder, a Victorian true crime podcast. This is a Good Night snack episode available exclusively for my housekeeper and butler tier patrons. Earlier this month, I covered the Radium Girls on the regular podcast feed, and then the Matchstick Girls as bonus content here on Patreon. In keeping with that theme, tonight's Good Night snack is about another brave set of women that sacrificed their well-being and often their lives in the interest of progress. This is the story of the Canary Girls. A Good Night for a Murder is a true crime podcast that does cover stories including death, violence, sexual assault, and other adult themes. Please take care while listening. World War I began on July 28, 1914. On August 4th, Germany invaded Belgium, which led Britain to declare war. That first weekend, after Britain entered the war, over 100 men and hours signed up to join the armed forces. The result was a significant decrease of skilled workers in Britain's factories. With men emptying out of Britain's factories and onto the battlefield, it quickly became apparent that in order to keep the country going, something was going to have to change. Efforts to fill the gaps were made by offering overtime and recruiting older men, but the shortage of young, able-bodied men was sorely felt across every industry. It was felt most of all, however, in munitions production. Prior to 1914, there were only a few munitions factories making explosives, mostly for the Navy. Britain had never had a greater need for munition and artillery production than now, and here they were with no one to make them. Early on, the government realized that they were going to have to open these jobs to women, but there was reluctance to do so. Trade unions were worried about how this would affect the working rights of the men upon their return from war. There were concerns over the hostility of existing male workers towards women. There was uncertainty as to whether women would even be capable of such work. And if women went into the factories, who would fulfill all the menial and domestic work in homes? The stark reality, though, was that the way they were doing things now was not working. In May of 1915, what would come to be referred to as the shell crisis came to a head. The shortage of shells and munitions had reached a critical breaking point. Not nearly enough shells were being produced, and those that were often defective and did not explode. In response, on July 2, 1915, the government passed the Munitions of War Act, naming David Lloyd George the new Minister of Munitions. In response to the shell crisis, the ministry quickly commissioned the building of 170 national filling factories around Britain, the largest of which was built near Gretna that spanned an area of 2 miles wide by 9 miles long. These factories followed mostly the same design, including small, lightweight buildings, well separated and connected by raised walkways with rails used to transport materials and supplies between buildings on carts. Shells, fuses, packing cases, and explosives were brought in by train to the edge of the factory, and completed munitions were packed off by rail as well. But who would work in these 170 new factories? Hey everyone, it's Kim, and I wanted to let you know that you're listening to a preview of a Patreon-only series from A Good Night for a Murder called A Good Night Snack. Episodes are released once a month and are only available at the housekeeper and butler tier on Patreon. If you like the Victorian Society tips in the regular episodes, you're probably going to like these. In this series, I focus on profiling famous Victorian people, Victorian lifestyle and society roles, and more historical true crime that may not be enough to build an entire episode out of, but works for a quick Victorian true crime fix. Hence the series name, A Good Night Snack. So if you're enjoying the episode, I'm going to play a little bit more for you right now, but if you want to hear the whole thing and more like it, head over to my website at agoodnightforamurder.com, where you can find the link for my Patreon and join at the housekeeper and butler tier. Now back to the story. In 1914, approximately 24% of working-age women were already employed, mainly doing domestic jobs as shop assistants or unskilled work in small factories. Whether or not the new Ministry of Munitions had the same qualms as others about women working in factories was beside the point. They needed them. So, in addition to building the new factories, one of the first things it did was to conduct studies as to the suitability of women to meet the demands of such work. The result was the launch of a new campaign that asked men to take the colors and women to fill the shells. The ministry made official recommendations on the employment and payment of women and recruited a workforce of single women to run the shell-filling factories. The women were housed near the factories in essentially barrack-style accommodations built just for them. Special trains would transport them to and from shifts. Most women were in their teens and early 20s. In fact, women were supposed to be at least 18 to be employed in the munitions factories, but girls as young as 14 often signed up. The work was a step up from that of domestic service. It often paid better, and even though the shifts ran around the clock, the hours were often less than what was required by domestic work. For many, it was an opportunity at financial independence and freedom from the restraints of life at home with overbearing families. Plus, they were serving their country, supporting their brothers, fathers, uncles, and friends who had gone off to war. With over 900,000 women eventually being employed in the industry, munitions factories quickly became the largest employer of women in England. They called these women munitionettes. Now, when I heard shell-filling factories, I, for some reason, pictured assembly lines of women working on 6 or 8 inch kind of grapefruit-sized bombs. Don't ask me why, that's just what my mind picked. But the women actually worked on manufacturing shells ranging from the size of small hand grenades all the way up to ones that stood 4 and 5 feet tall. The work itself was to mix up a substance called cordite, which was a smokeless propellant made from guncotton, nitroglycerin, and Vaseline petroleum, and combine that with the explosive, which was TNT, and then fill the empty shells with the mixture and hope it doesn't explode in the process. The mixing process was done by hand, literally with their hands. I have a photo of the women mixing cordite and TNT in a huge vat up to their elbows in the stuff. Women worked 12-hour shifts 6 days a week and were offered bonuses to encourage faster production. Most lived in temporary accommodations and shared a bed with a woman who was on the opposite shift. In an article written in 1916 after a visit to H.M. Factory Gretna, Rebecca West wrote, "Surely never before in modern history can women have lived a life so parallel to that of the regular army. The girls who take up this work sacrifice almost as much as the men who enlist. It is barrack life." One Hereford newspaper wrote that the treatment of the women was, quote, "the best, a factory where a breakfast is to be had for free and a half-hour dinner for 8 pence is the reward for an 8.5-hour shift, and where there is a lady supervisor and a lady doctor on hand, and where a welfare committee takes seriously its duties to provide." This has been a Good Night Snack episode from A Good Night for a Murder. To hear the full story and more like it, plus unlock the bonus content that accompanies each regular episode, head on over to my website at agoodnightforamurder.com and sign up for the housekeeper and butler tier on Patreon. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you again soon.